There's a big push in the United States to have the Ten Commandments displayed in schools. But what do they really say? And if we answer that, I wonder if we would really want them. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. In the last episode, I shared the good news and bad news about some of the events in Exodus. Namely, the way that, on the one hand, there's good news that, for example, my friend Moses' viewpoint about God includes the view that there's a God who intervenes to rescue and to set free, to correct injustice and establish justice. On the other hand, that same God is portrayed as hardening the heart of a man so that he'll disobey, and worse, is said to have actively killed children as an act of retribution. And I summarized the way that the approach I refer to as mutualism works in how I interpret all that. In particular, the way that Jesus and the sacred wisdom of Buddhism, and I included some of the various Hindu insights, gave me places to stand from which I can process how to, as it were, eat the meat and spit out the bones that I find in Exodus. I won't repeat it all here, of course. It's all in episode 29 after all. So in summary, with Jesus, I view things from the viewpoint that God is love with a big L. And that doesn't mean some kind of bland, warm, fuzzy love. It's an exacting, piercingly honest love. But I can't imagine Jesus reading Exodus and saying, yeah, well, that's what God would do. God would harden a man's heart to get him to disobey and then punish him for it. And yeah, God would kill children. I just can't imagine that. And then from my so-called Eastern friends, I've come to a viewpoint by which I interpret the story of the plagues, including the way the death of children is presented there and the stubbornness of Pharaoh's heart is described. I see them as kind of outworkings of karmic effects which built up over the long years of injustice and systemic racism and enslavement and mistreatment of the people of Israel. There are consequences. But to repeat something from episode 29, I don't view those karmic effects in a purely individualistic sense. Karma is not just what I face because of what I've done. We're interconnected, and so the impact of our karmic effects is going to be interconnected as well. Well, as we continue in Exodus, we're going to face more of this kind of good news, bad news effect, more examples of ways I think Moses was onto something good, intuiting ways to see or inspired to see better ways to form and live as a community of people. But interwoven with all the good, there are some things really difficult to swallow if we look carefully. So to use another analogy that I'll use pretty frequently in this episode, if Moses is cooking soup, then there's going to be flavors and ingredients that I find delicious and nutritious. That's the good news. There's also some really sharp bones hidden in it too. And that's the bad news, and it means we have to swallow with care. The pot of soup that I will be tasting this time is going to be primarily the soup that we call the Ten Commandments. And there'll be some examples then from later on in Exodus of ways that some of those commands either get explained or the application of them gets explained in more detail. And that means I'm not going to look at all the commands that Exodus provides for us. For example, laws governing sacrifices or the priesthood or the building of the tabernacle or clean or unclean foods, etc. It also means I'm going to skim past some pretty major famous events like the parting of the Red Sea and miracles of water and manna and the pillar of cloud and fire, etc. I'm moving us in many ways in this episode from Egypt, where we have spent most of our time with the Moses episodes, to Mount Sinai in one fell swoop. Or I should say back to Mount Sinai, because we've been there before. By the time we get there this time, about 2 months have passed since the people left Egypt. The people have traveled about 300 miles in that 2-month period. And it's only about 5 miles a day, so it's a slow pace. But now we're at the mountain. Here we are. Moses is told to go up the mountain and receive these laws, the ways of life that are going to govern the common life of this people that is being formed in many ways for the first time. So I've come to Exodus chapter 20, and here's how it starts. God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. These first words are kind of a reminder of the people's identity and also of God's nature, a divine being who intervenes and delivers. And so for Moses, that's a description of what is real. God, a God who intervenes. But that's made necessary because something's gone wrong, and in this case, it's the fact that Israel needed to be rescued from enslavement. And now, in addition to God intervening, and he does that through the co-agency with Moses that we've looked at in prior episodes, intervening to correct injustice and establish justice, there's a question of, okay, so now what? We're free, we're delivered, now how do we live? Which is a window into how my friend would likely say, this is how it is good for humans to live. And that, of course, is a big part of how we should answer the question from Moses' point of view about how to fix what's gone wrong. Those are my 3 big questions ever since I brought the Buddha together with the Jesus of John to have a conversation. I've been circling around those questions. What's real? What's gone wrong? And how do we fix it? And the 10 Commandments are a really important part of Moses' point of view about how to fix it. I'm going to read them all at once together here with no comments inserted at first from me, and also even without some of the explanations that the text gives. I'm just going to give the commands in their simplest form right out of Exodus, starting with verse 3 of chapter 20. 1. You shall have no other gods before me. 2. You shall not make for yourself an image. 3. You will not misuse the name of the Lord your God. 4. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. The 5th command, honor your father and mother. Number 6, you shall not murder. 7, you shall not commit adultery. 8, you shall not steal. 9, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. And 10, you shall not covet. Historically, commentators have noted that there's kind of 2 divisions, 2 tablets sometimes they talk about here out of these 10. The first 4 commands all have to do with the people's relationship with God. No other gods, no images, don't misuse the name, keep the Sabbath. And the next 6 commands govern the people's relationships among themselves. Honor parents, no murder, no adultery, no theft, no false accusations, no coveting. So let's look first at this life with God set of commands. The first 4 commands serve to describe Israel's relationship with the divine, or at least aspects of it, starting with that very first command, which again is, you shall have no other gods before me. Now the text says, I am Yahweh Elohe, and you shall have no other Elohim above me. And I see an interesting approach here to the world of supernatural beings. There are other Elohim, the text acknowledges. There's other supernatural beings. And the text actually isn't altogether forbidding some sort of connection or relationship with them. It does clearly preserve a special, unique we could even say monogamous relationship with Yahweh for the people of Israel. A relationship with Yahweh as compared to these other Elohim, not just among them, but above them. No other God above me among those Elohim. So it's an exclusivity, and yet it acknowledges that there are other beings. And then the next commandment, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. Pretty comprehensive explanation there. And note that this isn't about not making idols or images of other gods or other Elohim. I'm not saying that that would have been permitted, but that's actually not what this is addressing. This is a rule about making an image for Yahweh, the exclusive relationship that they are to have. And the background of this should take us all the way back to some of our early episodes with Moses, back to Genesis 1, when we learn that God made human beings in the image of God, at least according to the viewpoint of the books of Moses. And the thrust of this command then is that God has already established what the image of God is. God's already made God's own image of God's self, the form and likeness that we're to look at or think about that depicts what God is like. And it's human beings. It's humanity. So to just try to describe God with any other image or item or thing is, in the view of this author, an act of rejecting that image that God themselves made. Don't make an image for God. God's already made one. And this isn't just about honoring God, by the way. It's not just about the God side of this. It's also about the value, identity, and dignity of humanity. To make another image for God is a way of diminishing the value of humanity, devaluing humanity, devaluing, in a sense, ourselves. So again, God is saying here, in a way, let me be me. Don't make up your own versions of me. Don't put me in your boxes. Don't make images of me in your own mind. I've already shown you the image that shows you what I'm like. Human beings. Let me be me. I'm Yahweh. And as I told Moses at the burning bush, I am who I am. But this is, while it's kind of delicious and nutritious soup in my view, this is also a place I find a bone in the soup. The text adds a comment here about the consequences of disobeying this command, of making an image. Here's what the text says. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents, down to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. The bone here, for me, is the idea that God would actively punish future generations for something our ancestors did. Now, to say there's consequences from the actions of people in the past that we still face today, that's obvious. That doesn't even require a theory of karma to prove. We just see it. Things we do today will affect people who live generations beyond us. But I don't see those as ways that God is directly punishing us or people in the future for what people have done or what we're doing now. Consequences or karmic effects are not just negative, however, in this passage. I think this is a really interesting thing to bring out. The text goes on to say something that might be surprising. So after this statement that God would punish the third and fourth generation of children, which again, I don't think is part of the soup. I think it's a bone we need to pick out based on what I think Jesus and Buddha would say. There comes this passage. It's in verse 6 of chapter 20. I show love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. For Moses, there's a kind of limitation on the negative consequences and effects, the punishment. That's down to the third or fourth generation. But there seems to be essentially an unlimited amount of compassion poured on the people who are devoted to God. In the way of thinking of my Eastern friends, an unlimited karmic effect of positive actions. And that, to be honest, that encourages me that, okay, the good stuff I do is going to have this amazing, huge, vast impact that maybe is uncountable. All right, well, be that as it may, at the very least, I think from Moses' perspective, we can say that love is bigger and more long-lasting and wider in its impact than this punishment that the text refers to. So there is delicious flavor in the soup, even here where I'm having to work around a bone. Now I'm going to skip down to the Sabbath command, and in part, again, that's because I find some bones here. But there's also some soup, so let's look at it. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, and that gets spelled out how you keep it holy later, and we won't go into all those details. But here it says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. The seventh day is a Sabbath. It's a rest towards God. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So God rests, we're told. And again, this kind of ties into this very human, realistic, sort of, so to speak, personality of the divine being that we find woven throughout the books of Moses, that God rests here. But I think that there's also this point. God rests, and you're made in God's image, so you should rest. If God rests, then rest is part of the essence of what's real, and therefore, to live in accord with what's real, you too should rest. Now, here I want to bring in something I find interesting from the fifth of the books of Moses, Deuteronomy, chapter 5. When the Ten Commandments are given there, because it's kind of a retelling of the history of these books of Moses that we find in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, Deuteronomy kind of retells that whole story. And in the giving of the commandments, as it's told there, we're told that the Sabbath is instituted for a reason. In Exodus, that reason was because God rested on the seventh day. In Deuteronomy, there's a different reason given. Here's how it says, or how it speaks. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath. So in both cases, the commandment about keeping the Sabbath is telling us something about the nature of God, about how Moses answers the question, what is real? There is something about rest, according to Exodus and its version of this command, that is woven into the very fabric of reality, ultimate reality, God's own nature, and therefore should be part of ours. And there is something about intervening to establish justice that is woven into the very fabric of reality, ultimate reality, the nature of God, and therefore is something that we too celebrate and live into, and we'll be told elsewhere throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, seek to instill as well, justice. Now, I said that there was a bone associated with the Sabbath. It's not found right here in the text, but later, one of the punishments for breaking the Sabbath is the death penalty. And that, I've heard all the defenses of that. I understand how people who want to defend every word of the Bible as being from God try to argue why it made sense to institute a death penalty for breaking the Sabbath. And of course, there have been Christians throughout history who've actually tried to do that literally, or at least instilled very serious punishments for breaking their definition of the Sabbath. But I do have to wonder if Buddha and Jesus were sitting here with me and I turned to them and asked their opinion, what they would say. Actually, I don't have to wonder. I know very well what they would say. That punishment doesn't fit the crime. It's a bone that I think we have to pick out. All right, now I'm going to turn to the portion of the Ten Commandments that talk about life together. We've been looking at life with God. There's 6 commands focused on community life. I think even that is kind of significant, that 4 can be directly attributed to how to live with God, and 6, the majority of them, how to live together. Now, however, even making that distinction, I think, is a external, later, probably Western philosophy, Western culture-oriented distinction. I'm not so sure that those things are so distinct in the way that the mind of the culture that is behind this text really worked, that kind of dichotomy. Be that as it may, I'm going to look at these 6. And here they are again in their briefest form. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet. These can be seen as a way to define the sort of mutual relationships that would be required to create a social environment, a social ecosystem that's safe. One with what today we might call healthy boundaries, one in which people can live in a shared trust where intergenerational relationships are valued and life itself is valued and our most intimate relationships are guarded and protected and property is valued. It's a community in which honesty prevails. If a society as a whole enshrines and guards these values, it would ensure an ecosystem of public life in which everyone can feel secure, protected, and free. Now, there's 2 of these 6 that I actually want to elaborate on because a lot of this is good soup, delicious and nutritious. But I do want to highlight where I find some bones. And it begins right with the first one, honor your father and your mother. Now let me focus first on what I think is the soup. I take it in a much broader and more expansive sense than the nuclear family that I think most of my fellow Western culture influenced listeners might take it. You know, a mom and a dad and 2.7 children, we like to joke about in the United States. I think it's a much broader thing here. It's about honoring our ancestors, but how far back do we take that? Where does that line stop? I mean, okay, does that include my grandparents? Well, then, if I'm going to go that far back, why not their parents? And for that matter, if I'm going that far back, why not their grandparents? The parents of my grandparents, the grandparents of the parents of my grandparents. I mean, where do you stop? How far back does it really go? For me, I see no reason not to take it all the way back, which means I take this when I'm meditating on this command as honoring the very first humans, whoever they were, whenever they came on the scene, and however it happened, which means I take this to mean that we are to honor our shared human origins, shared with all other human beings. So racism, nationalism, classism, sexism are all ways that we mistreat our siblings, which then dishonors our shared ancestors and our common parents and breaks this command. Because after all, at some point, we've all got the same origins, the same ancestors. Honor your parents means we need to honor one another, no matter how different or diverse we may be. The importance of this one is highlighted when Moses delivers the instructions for what to do as punishment if this one is broken. And it does serve to highlight how serious this command is. So that's the positive side of the punishment for breaking this that I'm about to explain. I'm trying to give it a little bit of benefit of the doubt. It at least shows how serious this commandment is to honor our common ancestry. But there's a bone here in the soup too, because the command is, and we find this out later in Exodus, if a son or daughter dishonors their parents, they're to be put to death. Now, it's not spelled out actually that clearly in Exodus. The clearest, most relevant section dealing with this comes from that book of Deuteronomy I mentioned earlier in chapter 21. And I'm going to start at verse 18. And I'm going to read a long section here to make the point of where I think the bone is found. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his mother and father shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of the town, which is the place where decisions got made. And they will say to the elders, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard." And then all the men of the town are to stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. Notice that it's the parents that are supposed to initiate this, knowing full well what's going to happen. And the context suggests to me that there's probably a lot going on here. This isn't just a case of one day a son, and notice that it's sons that are focused on here. It isn't just that one day a son spoke back to his mother. There's a lot more going on here. It's not an isolated incident, and it seems to include what we would know of today as the disease of addiction. There's reference to being a drunkard. And in that case, there's situations for us today where I think the only course of action is to create boundaries. That's how you respond to not be codependent. Even sometimes to really severely sever contact and refuse to share in any form of enablement. I can't imagine, however, any court of law ever condoning as appropriate and legal the killing of a son or daughter by their parents if they're an addict. Now, that's just kind of looking at it from a human perspective, much less turning to my friends Buddha and Jesus to ask their opinion, and I think we all know what they would say. Now, I'm not going to look at all the laws in the books of Moses that require the death penalty. That in and of itself could be a whole episode, because there's quite a few. I'm simply going to say here that my primary response, again, inspired by Jesus and the Buddha, who, if they condoned the death penalty at all in any situation, would certainly not agree with Moses in most of the cases, if any, that we find in those laws. So, there's a bone to pick with honoring parents. The honor of ancestors and common humanity, delicious soup. The bone, the death penalty for breaking that. Next, we come to the law about coveting. So I'm skipping over the laws about adultery and lying and stealing, etc. Even though I could kind of sift through Exodus and Deuteronomy and probably find bones in the punishments for those, I've decided to zero in on the law about coveting, and maybe why will become clear as we proceed. So in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, it says, "You shall not covet." But it goes on to say more. And listen to this carefully and the order in which it shows up. "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, donkey, ox, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." Now, I'm going to look for the soup first and the deliciousness and the nutritiousness. And on the one hand, do not covet is appropriate. And as a command, what it's actually doing is taking us deeper than simply like don't steal, right? It's actually going to a heart level of something. It's a heart level kind of pre-law, a preventative law to, say, the law against stealing. For it goes to the very heart of the issue, the envy, the jealousy, the comparison, the competition, the selfishness that could lead to stealing. Coveting could lead to that, right? And in fact, it can lead to murder and lying and much more. But this command is simply saying, talking about something that's happening in the heart. Covet, wanting. And that's a beautiful thing. and it's nutritious. And I find it helpful that Moses actually goes to the heart and not just external behavior. But there is a bone, and it's a really sharp one. In fact, there's actually a couple of sides to this bone. And so before we swallow, we need to sort of pull it out and have a look. Because what this command reveals is the view that some human beings can be seen as property. And the two dimensions of this bone, maybe it's two bones, maybe it's two jagged edges of the same bone, has to do with wives, and it has to do with the fact that it is assuming institution of slavery. Not slavery as we might know it from American history, but it is nevertheless ownership of other human beings. We're going to explore that here in a moment. So do not covet, yeah, but don't covet what? Well, there's a list. And again, I want to go through the order of this. Don't long for the houses of others. Or, last on the list, their animals, which can be equivalent to someone's means of wealth or the indicators of their wealth. But in that same list, right here in between, not even at the top of the list, in between, nestled in between, shuffled in between houses and animals, are wives and slaves. In other words, wives and slaves, or servants, depending on the translation you're using, are included in the very middle of the list of property, just along with everything else. Now, I'm going to have to dig into this, and it's going to get a little dark because there are bones in the soup, as I've said. Let me start with the good news. There's a section of Exodus that includes laws that are aimed at actually protecting the dignity of people. And because they're there in the text, I want to be sure that I highlight this because on the one hand, I do think Moses is feeling his way towards a way of being human beings together. But so let me start with that good news. But even here, there's a bone that we're going to come across. So we need to be careful. I'm skipping all the way to chapter 22 of Exodus and verse 21. It says, "Don't mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt." I brought this up early in our episodes with Moses, and I really think that his own experience as a foreigner in Egypt and as a foreigner in Midian is part of what sensitized him to this command. And then it goes on to say, "Don't take advantage of the widow or of the fatherless, because if you do and they cry out to me, I'm going to hear their cry." Now, so far, this is really good soup. It's really important. This is a crucial way for thinking about how a society would function together. But now there's a bone. Because if people don't follow these rules, then according to the text, God has a response, which is, "My anger will be aroused and I'll kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows and your children fatherless." Now again, I think Jesus and Buddha would interject here about the idea of God coming in to kill and then rendering women widows and children orphans. Ostensibly, women and children who may have had no responsibility for the disobedience of the men that had just gotten killed, but are nonetheless covered in the punishment. And who are supposedly, by the way, widows and orphans, the very people that God has just said he wants the people to protect. So this is a bone to remove from the soup. Now, in Moses' defense, the text at least shows that God takes this kind of justice very seriously. Or perhaps it's another instance of the reality where this is a way of talking about karmic effects when the author wouldn't have had that concept. I don't know. But it's a bone as far as I'm concerned. Now let me get back to the good news, to the good soup that I was already noting in chapter 22. It goes on to say, "If you lend money to one of my people among you who's needy, don't treat it like a business deal. Don't charge interest. Don't take advantage of them, in other words. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge for something, give it back by sunset, because that cloak's the only covering they have. What else can they sleep in, the text says? And when they cry out to me, I'm going to hear because I am compassionate. So notice that underneath all the specific rules, there's this deeper subsoil that every once in a while kind of pops up. The essence to it all. Do all these things, treat all these people with compassion because God is compassionate. This is part of Moses' understanding of what is real, compassion. And I believe this, too, is connected to the way that Moses understands human nature because of humans being made in God's image. So if God is compassionate, it follows that this is in the nature of human beings as well and part of what we ought to be. So in response to what is real and what went wrong and how to fix it, there's a thread, a small one, almost buried in the text, easy to miss unless you look closely, but still present nonetheless, a thread that says the fix to what went wrong is actually embedded in the very heart of the nature of what is real, and that's compassion. Compassion is ultimately grounded in the nature of the divine itself. Now, if all this from chapter 22 had come before the 10th commandment, I think we might be shocked then to see the way that the command ends up including the view that some people can be property, because everything we've been reading in chapter 22 would argue for the opposite. But it's here, right in the 10 Commandments themselves. Don't covet anybody's property. And then it spells out property to include women and servants or slaves. Between the list of the 10 Commandments and the material from chapter 22 we just looked at comes chapter 21. And this is where, as I said above, it gets especially dark. And before I read the section in question, let me say up front here, I have researched the ways that the material in this chapter is defended and interpreted to give it a positive spin. I have particularly looked at how it's viewed by Christians because at present in my country, there is, as I've mentioned at the outset of this episode, a huge push by Christians to bring back the 10 Commandments. And given that the 10th includes this reference to people as property, it seems important to understand what at least some Christians do with what I see as the bones in the soup, which, of course, some don't see as a problem, which is, I think, more disturbing. I don't agree with the ways people defend the text, but I'm more disturbed by those who don't make any attempt to defend it at all, because there is a huge move in our country to, in a sense, go backwards on the movements towards equality of women and people of other races and ethnicities and people who are different. We're sort of moving backwards on that in our country right now. And there are people who just make no apology for that. Again, I can be sympathetic to people who at least try to defend this and put a positive spin on it because, in my view, at least they're acknowledging that they see there's a problem, and they see that there needs to be compassion and equality. I don't agree with them that the text is teaching those things that we're about to look at, but I at least admire the attempt. All right, my take on this should be clearer once you hear the various laws within chapter 21, because right now you're kind of wondering what I'm talking about. So I'm going to read a big section, and then I'll comment on several points. All right, this is coming from chapter 21. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he's to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. And by the way, I'm using the word servant here because it's found in the English translation of the text I'm using. It's the same word for slave. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he's free to go alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she's to go with him. If his master gives him a wife while being enslaved, and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children belong to the master, and only the man will go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master, my wife and children, and I don't want to go free, in other words, if that man who can go free but would lose his wife and children in doing so says, I don't want to lose them, then his master has to take him before the judges. He'll take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl, and then he'll be his servant for life. If a man, notice this, sells his daughter as a slave, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he's broken faith with her. But notice she has no right to go free. There are some protections in place, but she doesn't get to go free the way the men do. If he selects her for his son, so here's a man who has purchased a woman and decides to give this property to his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. Now, that is better than some of the surrounding societies. If he marries another woman, he the son, he must not deprive this first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these things, she can go free without payment of money. And then later in the same chapter, related to the treatment of servants, notice this. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they're not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, because the slave is their property. Now, what are we to make of all this? Let me begin with the good news, as hard as it may be to find in all of that, and then, or at least the least bad news, and then I'll go on to the bad news. First, there's several places in which I think we have to acknowledge that there's some sort of a mitigation or a set of limitations and a perspective that reveals that the enslavement or servitude described here is not the kind of slavery that, for example, we may be most familiar with in the history of America. And certainly other countries have their versions of that too. I'm American, so I'm going to speak about my own people. For example, servitude in this case, enslavement in this case, is not permanent. After 7 years, or isn't necessarily permanent, after 7 years, the owner has to grant the servant freedom unless the servant chooses to stay, or unless the servant is a woman. In the case where a servant does choose to stay, there's a public ceremony to make it known, and presumably it probably means the owner treated the servant well, or it could mean that, or it simply may be that as difficult as it is, that slave wants to be with their family. Another example of less bad, as I might put it, is that there are rules established to assure a female servant's right to provision is guarded. Notice she can't go free, but at least that provision might be guarded in certain situations. An owner who, and there's also less bad news, I suppose, if we look at the rules about an owner who beats a servant. An owner who beats a servant to death is actually subject to the death penalty, which at least reveals how seriously Moses took the mistreatment of a person owned by another if it led to their death. All right, but none of that, with all those mitigations and limitations, and I'm doing my best to give the benefit of the doubt, none of that should cloud our vision if we look carefully at all this. And I'm sure you've noticed the things that I'm about to mention. Underneath this entire section, the reality is that there are people in desperate situations for whom the only way to provide themselves and have food and shelter was to sell themselves to someone else. And that is, by the way, one of the big differences between this and most examples of slavery that we might be assuming. In many cases, this is people selling themselves to an owner so that they at least have the security of a place to live and food to eat. Yet, it is still a view that other people can be property. And by the way, when someone, because of their own desperate economic situation, sells themselves to another person, that's a power dynamic that is absolutely rife with opportunity for abuse. Even during the 7-year limited time frame, this favors the power of the wealthier owner. Even deeper than this, the passage reveals the substrata worldview, in fact, the raw fact of how Moses sees things, that some people can own other people and sell other people, even sell their own daughters, and in some cases divide families and grant a husband and father freedom, but keep the wife and children as their own property. And then there's this, going back to the owner beating the slave, the owner is within their rights to beat the servant with a rod, a stick. It's violent. It's painful. And there's danger of death. We're told that, and we know that because it's okay to do this as long as the servant doesn't die, as long as they recover in a day or two. That's not just a bruise on the back of the hand. I sincerely believe that my friend Moses was, there's evidence for this that I've tried to point out, feeling his way towards a just and humane vision of humanity. I really do. But there are some really sharp bones in this soup that need to get picked out before we just swallow it all. Yes, there's limitations, mitigations woven into the books of Moses. There's places where there's glimpses of justice and compassion, but there's classism and misogyny and cruelty. And along with portions that reveal a universalism in the sense of divine purposes for the care and good of all people, regardless of ethnicity and culture, there is very stark racism in the books of Moses. So this whole section about the 10th commandment in particular, about coveting, reveals this substrata of views of people and ways of treating people and views of women and ways of treating women that betray something dark, something that's haunted humanity for generations in many cultures, for centuries. So, let me go back to the question that I asked at the outset. Knowing more about what the 10 Commandments actually say, do we really want these displayed in schools? Do they really represent what we want our children to learn? Do they really represent, as some argue, the values on which our country was built? I think you could actually make a case they do represent those values upon which, some of the values upon which our country was built, but I don't think they represent the values inherent in, for example, the Declaration of Independence. All people created equal and possessing inalienable rights together. That's what that says. Now, I do think our founders actually shared some of the values that are inherent in some of the bones that I've been pointing out. I don't want those things in our schools because I want to pick the bones out. All right, bones and soup. I've been using that metaphor a lot, and there is good soup in Moses, and there are sharp and jagged bones. And you are well aware by now of the criteria I've been using for identifying what I see as bones and what I see as good, delicious, nutritious soup in the books of Moses. The primary finders of bones for me, the machine I use as I'm walking along, the coin finders, the metal detectors that people use. My metal detectors, or bone detectors, if you will, are Jesus and the Buddha. And while I've brought their perspectives in here and there and occasionally throughout these episodes, I'm just about ready to get everyone in the same room. Moses, Buddha, Jesus, and have another conversation. But there's one more thing I want to mention about Moses before I do that. Even though it seems like it might be sort of out of the blue, and not really in the flow of this whole conversation, I do want to end the Moses episodes with the account of how things ended for him. Because in my mind, it's a kind of tender event. It's tinged with sadness. And perhaps I'm drawn to it because of my own stage in life as an older person, but it's one of the events that creates in me a sense of kinship with this man, Moses, this man I call my friend in spite of our differences and disagreements. You see, Moses died without ever entering the land that he'd been told he would lead the people into. The reason he was forbidden to enter was due to a single act of anger on his part. The people had faced another situation in which they'd run out of water, and they grumbled and they complained, and God told Moses to speak to a rock and that water would flow miraculously out of the rock. But Moses, frustrated with the people, in his anger at their whining and grumbling, struck the rock with his stick. It was an overreaction, I think, and it seems like God thought so too. It was an overreaction and, in my mind, a minor and very understandable action. But it resulted in God's decision to block him from going into the land. Now, if Moses overreacted, and I think that's arguable, it seems to me that God did as well. The text doesn't tell us anything about how Moses felt about this. God saying, oh, you hit the rock, I told you to just talk to it, now you can't ever go into the promised land. I can only imagine my own reactions. It would seem so unfair that after 40 years of bearing the brunt of leadership and responsibility, that one apparently insignificant act could have such a huge consequence. It's part of the picture of God in the books of Moses that I'm going to return to in the next conversation among my friends. It's part of this kind of real human divine being that the books of Moses present. And it's kind of also, as I said, why I'm drawn to this story and why I wanted to share it here. Because there is actually a tender, moving aspect to the way this ends between God and Moses right at the time of Moses' death. At this point, Moses is 120. He's still healthy and vibrant, but he's at the end of his days. He climbs up another mountain from which we're told that God shows him the land that the people will enter. And Moses dies there, alone, except for the presence of God. And we're told this, that God, by God's own hand, buried Moses in a valley that only God knows, the location only God knows. No one knows where this is. There is something mysterious about this, and as I say, I think tender and intimate. Moses is sometimes called a friend of God, and you can kind of see it here. These two had been through a lot together, if you want to picture God as a fellow old man up there with Moses. And it's a tender moment. I think this ending of Moses' life is for me a sort of picture of, again, as I said just a few minutes ago, this portrayal of the divine character that Moses brings into the conversation among the religious heritages of humanity. There's this sort of kind of almost arbitrary, human, reactionary, angry, compassionate, caring, punishing side. A side that reacts to a single insignificant action in this case with such a consequential punishment, but there's this compassion and tenderness to accompany Moses right up to the moment of his death and then bury him with God's own hands. So, more soup, more bones all through this episode, and now a lot to talk about with Jesus and the Buddha next time.